you guys argue that the school to prison pipeline, STPP, metaphor emerged in the late 1990s and gained traction despite limited empirical backing. Why do you think the metaphor caught on so widely among activists, politicians, and even scholars? Who wants to go first?
That's a great question. First of all, thanks so much for having me here. I'm a longtime watcher and a fan of the show, so this is really wonderful. Um, that's a really great question. I mean, one is that it's really catchy.
Yeah.
It's a simplistic explanation. It's
Yeah.
sexy. I mean, not really sexy, but like it has this ring to it. We've
Mhm.
had a colleague who said it just rolls off the tongue really well. But the deeper it it has been laden with this idea of like being kind of radical. Liberals kind of capture it as this broad critique of all the things we don't like, which is prisons and punitiveness. But our article and our work suggests that it's like a bit of a deeper political reason that it catches on, and that's that it rolls very compatibly with neoliberalism.
Mm.
And it really doesn't challenge any of the deeper issues of what's going on in terms of what was driving punitiveness in schools, what was driving the violence that you talked about in your experience. And it certainly ignores a lot of the explanations of what's actually driving mass incarceration. And as Dan has, shown in a lot of his work, it's the preferred punching bag schools, public schools, rather than deeper critiques of capitalism, of economic inequality. And so it's really fostered and fueled by large charitable foundations and nonprofit organizations that I think tend to gravitate towards that type of explanation. Ones that are critical of the worst excesses of economic inequality, but don't really want to take it on directly.
Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I basically what Sarah said, but I was kind of struck by, when you were introducing it, this idea of, some of the films of the 80s or whatever, talking about the crime wave. And, we've done some other work trying to figure out when was it that the juvenile justice system and education actually kind of got drawn together. And you can actually go back even farther to the 1950s. And 60s, and then another film, Blackboard Jungle, where part of the sort of the fear was that schools were going to be become a site of sort of violence and needed to be controlled because of integration. And there you saw sort of a desire to draw the schools into the criminal justice system back then, and you do see efforts to tie it as far back as the 1950s, and then you get this sort of back and forth, like in the so you sort of get a little bit of leniency, and schools can help solve this, and then no, schools are the problem, and so the school to prison pipeline is just another iteration of this idea that fundamentally would explain sort of some of these factors like crime or inequality can be laid at the foot of schools. And yeah, I think the key point is what Sarah said, that part of its popularity, and it's popular across the political spectrum, is due to the fact that it works hand in glove with neoliberalism. It does not demand more funding. It sort of individualizes the sources of crime, and also tends to blame teachers and teachers' unions in particular for sort of failing. So there's a lot of reasons why I think it has become broadly popular. And we can get into more specifics if you want, but
I
I
mean,
think as a broad explanation, that's probably a good one.
I'm a pop culture guy, probably to a fault, and I definitely grew up on the, I guess we'll say, the mid to late '80s influx of these movies about inner city schools being kind of these just bastions of incorrigible youth that later we'll say are being warehoused, but at the time it's just like, well, this is the school and it's falling apart, and it persists kind of until the '90s even.
Mhm.
um the '90s we get the hero's tale, right? We get 187, and
Mhm.
what's the one with Scarface's girlfriend,
Oh,
Michelle Pfeiffer, where she saves all the
yeah,
kids?
it's with the Coolio song.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Gangster's Paradise. What is that one?
What is that one? But But the 80s had got like real life people like Joe Clark, right? In the East Coast. I believe was he in Jersey or New York, where he takes over East Side High. And because the kids are so bad at that school, he has to keep the doors locked with chains to keep the drug dealers out. Right. And this is around the same time that we're starting to get, not necessarily on a federal level, but locally, we're going to start having tougher sentences on the youth. Also, was it 88 is when you have the Central Park Five, which the next thing we have after that is the super predator, right? It's like, well, we have to put these kids away. This isn't stealing a pocketbook. These are super predators. And even if you go back to the 50s and 60s, those kind of stay out of trouble young man movies that were made, they kind of get rehabilitated through the system and come out good little people. Whereas in the 80s, there is no rehabilitation for these people. Like they need to be locked up for long periods of time. Does the school to prison pipeline metaphor for you guys feel like the inner city as colony metaphor that still kind of persists to this day? I mean, Kamala Harris's dad, Donald, I thought wrote the best piece about why that isn't accurate in 74. And we still hear people talk about inner city as colony in 2025. Is that something similar with the school to prison pipeline? Like Sarah said, it sounds good. And it enables you to have a campaign against something like tenured teachers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to this, Sarah. I'll start and then sort of throw it over to you. I mean, I think there's a couple of instances where this is definitely true. In the current moment, absolutely. Like it is totally tied up with this idea. Particularly, there's a strain of school to prison pipeline scholarship that argues, to quote one article title, "Schools suck because they're supposed to." And the idea is that schools are set up in order to create this outcome, which is sort of differential on the basis of sort of race. And therefore, I mean, the natural sort of political impetus that flows from that is that the enemy is public school. And what you have seen, unsurprisingly, is the right wing sort of pick up on that and sort of use that as a way to say, see, schools are sort of sending Black and brown kids to prison. Therefore, we have to get rid of these public schools and turn it over to private schools. And this builds off of a long history of this tendency to sort of frame or sort of call into questions whether or not public schools are truly on the side of the marginalized. I mean, there was this move to do this in the 1970s with Kenneth Clark and Floyd McKissick and Stokely Carmichael and others that sort of began to question whether or not the public school monopoly was ever capable of sort of advancing the interest of Black students particularly, and they began to call for sort of private community-controlled alternatives. So I do think that there is some of this sort of schools as a sort of school to prison pipeline sort of connected to this idea of like an internal colony, as you were suggesting, that is a through line, at least in some of the literature. I would say like part of the difficulty in nailing down what the hell the school to prison pipeline actually is because there are almost hundreds or even thousands of different sort of ideas that are wrapped up into this very simplistic metaphor. And if you try and nail one down, they'll say, oh, well, we actually mean it is something else. But there is that strand there that sort of you were suggesting.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much just picking up from Dan, what we kind of cataloged is how and where this is used. And yes, a big strand of it is that there's an intentional link between schools and prison. You get articles talking about how schools, I think you mentioned it, function as like a warehousing kind of conditioning kids to the conditions of prison because that's going to be the inevitable place that they end up. And this is particularly framed around the racist disparities of school discipline in this type of school. But as Dan mentioned, there's also a whole segment of the literature that says it's unintentional, and there's some that argue it's a direct link to prison, and others saying it's an indirect link. And so in our work, we've tried to really take seriously all these different causal claims. And we ultimately find that while each may have differences, that they fall pretty short empirically of describing, one, the mass incarceration crisis. I mean, it's not coming from public schools. Public schools are undergoing these punitive transformations that are occurring across the board, and so they're part of the rise of mass incarceration. But to think that, to position them as the starting point ignores just a wealth of scholarship and probably what most of us know in common sense, which is that it takes a lot of specific policies to arrest and lock up a lot of people almost entirely outside of schools, and then send them away to prison for a very, very long time, all as a way of containing and managing and suppressing inequalities that are produced through capitalism, neoliberalism, that create large groups of marginalized people who are outside of the economic mainstream. And so to basically ignore all of that and start the location of the story at public schools, yeah, again, to Dan's point, it fits into a long running and broad politics, both in Black nationalists, but also white conservatives who want to dismantle or undermine public education, which we think is misguided and not going to be the productive way to address racial inequalities or mass incarceration.
Is that the